Welcome back to another episode of The Hard Truth. I'm Zainabrights, and I'm joined by Analyst Batool Subeiti today to have just a casual conversation analyzing the ICJ ruling. A lot of things are up in the air. A lot of people don't know what to make of this, and we thought that Batool can help highlight really what's going on and what the ICJ ruling really means. Welcome to our show, Batool. It's nice
Thank
to
you for
have you.
having me, Zainab. It's my absolute pleasure to be back on.
So, Batul, tell us, we heard from the ICJ's initial provisional ruling, and there's mixed feelings about it because, a lot of people are saying this is a victory. It's much more than people expected it to be. And others are saying that because the ceasefire was not called, and that this case really might even take years for them to truly call it a genocide. What do you really make of this? Is this really a victory, and what can people take from this?
Right. So, in a nutshell, the outcome of the ICJ is that there is a plausible risk of genocide in Gaza. I personally wouldn't consider the outcome of the ICJ a victory, simply
Mhm.
based on the extent of the genocide in Gaza, and of course the context of Gaza, because we're talking about illegal besiegement that was followed from, over 40 years of illegal occupation. The ICJ couldn't have gone less than this. So less than, coming to the point where it calls it a plausible risk of genocide. Otherwise, it will lose its credibility. So what the ICJ did is it explicitly ordered the Israeli occupation military to stop killing Palestinians. In terms of going more than this and demanding for a ceasefire, it would be very naive to look at the ICJ as though it's some kind of independent or impartial body. It's really just an extension of the UN. It's actually the UN's top court. So
Yeah.
ultimately, as we know, the UN refers back to the decisions of the superpowers, and it's all based on their interests.
Mhm.
Lest we forget the fact that the UN, its origin was that it was created by the victors of World War II. So that's America and Britain. So an
Mhm.
international body like the ICJ will ultimately resort to outcomes decisions that will have many dimensions. They'll have many different faces, and they use that as they please, and they fit it to any situation that they want. So it's designated in such a way that each side will kind of take from it what it will. So let me give an example. The Israeli occupation entity might actually claim victory, that it was able to escape with there being no cause, for a ceasefire. You have America, who's the top sponsor of the occupation entity. They were not implicated in any way, nor was Britain. At the same time, this very ruling can be used as a pressure lever against the occupation entity, not just from the justice seeking entities of the world that really want to see justice and really want to see an end to not just the genocide, but the besiegement, but even America itself, even the US, can, in places where they want, they can use this ruling to pressure the occupation entity. They can use this as a kind of red card. So even
Mhm.
if America does not support the idea of charging the Israeli occupation entity with genocide right now, they allow the courts to label it as plausible genocide. But as we mentioned, that doesn't actually tangibly translate to anything in the current stage, but they might actually in the future use this to their benefit, especially given the ICJ is seen as an independent body. So the outcome
When you
itself,
when you
yeah.
when you say benefit, do you mean that when the United States and the powers lose interest in Israel in the
Right.
occupation, they just see it as a burden, as a liability?
Right. So this outcome, of course, it doesn't carry conviction when they don't want to convict, but it carries just enough room such that if they wanted to convict, they can rely on these court rulings. When we talk about the phase post October the 7th, that is a new phase, and it's also evolving with time. They had phase one of the battle, phase two, and now we're on phase three, where they've semi withdrew all of their troops on the ground because the occupation entity has proven that it's unwilling to face the
Mhm.
Gazan resistance in face-to-face combat. So the post-Israeli occupation entity failure phase after this current confrontation ends is not one where we can say it was the same as pre-October the 7th. The occupation entity from America's perspective cannot be relied on anymore. Why? It is a failure. You know, it's unable to protect itself, you know, let alone protect Western interests. And the West isn't just going to sit there and is going to keep supplying it with arms. And it doesn't care about facilitating the Zionist dream per se, as long as the Zionists are actually facilitating imperialist interests. But actually, it's
Mm,
proved such that the direction in the region is that you have these strong resistance forces on the ground that are inflicting so much harm on American interests. They're effectively disrupting the whole supply chain, that it's gotten to the
mm,
point that they're not willing to go through all of that to save
mm,
this fragile entity that's not even serving its interests. So moving forward, the whole discussion, the whole rhetoric is going to be around the destiny of the entity, its fitness for
mm,
life, so to speak. So there needs to be an understanding that with these court rulings, what transpires is the political interests. And a big
mm,
part of American interests is being able to actually control public perception. You know, that's why America has been able to reign for all these decades, you know, since the 90s. You know, they sell this idea of Hollywood, they sell this idea of American dream, for example. That's what the soft war is all about. But we've seen that
mm,
when this massacre has come, when this genocide has come, it's been so high profile, it's been so tangibly felt and seen by the world, that ultimately those masks of deception have fallen in a way that has never really been previously the case. And the
especially
reality is that it's
because
affecting their interests.
this is the first time Israel, the occupation entity, has been accused in the global, like, world
Mhm.
courts. This is the first time things have been laid out, um, and arguably people say, this is not enough to hold them accountable. But, like, what does this do for public perception, where people are slowly waking up and seeing what's happening now has been going on for a very long time.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the indicators of this public perception like changing on a mass scale is the fact that they even allowed this court case to proceed, and they didn't intervene on that level. You know, it's less in their interest almost to not allow this case to go through, because if they did it, then the backlash would be so much greater. So
Right.
even governments themselves, you know, they cannot get over certain facts. They can't ignore it. Otherwise, that would create a massive gap between them and the public. And at the same time, of course, you know, America has the ability to use those different means to pressure the ICJ whether to allow the decision to go forward or not. But I think in particular, in the elections, you know, this is going to be so transparent and so clear, the divide between those in power and the general perception. But a
Mhm.
point more broadly, just for the people of the justice seeking people of the world, it's like if we're awaiting justice from the ICJ, then really we haven't understood what these systems are designed for. What we can take from the ICJ is that the issue has become so decisive, so transparent, so clear, that even the systems that serve as tentacles for the imperialist hegemons are forced to admit that reality. So we almost want to shift that title from, you know, the ICJ is designed to invoke justice, to it's designed to kind of confirm and acknowledge the facts on the ground. You know, that's
Mhm.
as far as the ICJ is designed to capacitate. And that's exactly what it did. You know, it ignored the occupation entity's assertion for self-defense. You know, that was something that was completely ignored. And that was the main argument that the occupation entity used.
Mhm.
The ICJ went into detail about the evidence of genocide. So they stated the blatant facts. You
Mhm.
know, it was almost like a fact-finding case by the court. So what's
Mhm.
so important about this is that for us justice seeking people in the world, we can use this. You know, we can use this as a kind of base, you know, in the same way that we might use UN resolutions to make a point, or we might use Amnesty International, for example. When you want to
Mhm.
agitate in the belly of the beast, essentially, in corporate
Mhm.
capitalist companies, for example, in your workplace, if you want to ask them to divest, for example, from projects in the occupation entity, you know, you can use this as something to rest your case on. And of
Mhm.
course, also more pertinently, back to your question on public perception, I mean, the ICJ, its strength is that it's also exposed that colonial mentality of the
Mhm.
US, of Britain, of the collective West, that's not only turning a blind eye to the suffering, it's actually claiming it's not happening. It's actually outright rejecting it. You know, you can see that from the statements of the likes of Starmer, for example, Keir Starmer in the UK, who's the leader of the Labour Party, Rishi Sunak. You can see that from the likes of Kirby, you know, when he's asked to speak in press conferences. You know, they are
Mhm.
interested in nothing but saving the occupation entity from collapse right now. So ultimately, it's like these laws that exist within Western countries built upon justice and equality, and that forbid outright forms of oppression. We need to use that as our base through which the unjust actions through which the oppressions that are perpetrating by these same entities that have these laws, we need to use those laws as the base through which we target those unjust actions, and we call them out and we expose them, and we also seek to prosecute them. And so for that reason, you know, resistance, for example, the resistance made it very clear, they stand by the ICJ, they stand by you know, the case of South Africa, because only the naive would rely on the UN or would rely on the international community to liberate, you know. But if there is foot on the ground, if there is real action like what we're seeing from the resistance, Palestine, Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, all of them of course held by Iran, then this ICJ ruling, we should almost see it as a bonus. You know, it becomes an echo to that real action that's happening on the ground, but we don't expect that echo to be the action. That's the key
Right.
point
Right.
here. The echo is not the action, it's just the echo. And for that reason, of
Mm.
course, the resistance is going to support it, because it's just one of many tools. It's almost like a moral victory, you could see it, for the Palestinian cause. I mean, it also allows the resistance to vindicate armed resistance. You know, it's this case that, you know, the ICJ failed to call for a ceasefire, so it's our job to liberate the Palestinians, because no one else is going to liberate the Palestinians. No one else is going to shift the balance of powers on the ground. It cannot be shifted unless it's through this kind of armed conflict. That's ultimately how maps are carved.
Let's let's go back to, you know, what you said, but geopolitically and from the political landscape, you know, while this does help put the footing, like you said, and it gives people that, it lays everything out, it still, you said, does nothing politically. Can you expand on what that means?
Absolutely. I mean, so the biggest proof of that is that, you know, if we talk about an institution like the UN, you know, since its inception, okay, it was the UN that actually gave legitimacy towards the occupation entity. It was the UN that turned a blind eye towards the Nakba of 1948. That's not something that they're willing to talk about. That's something that they shy away from. They only talk about their datum, their base point is 1967. And so for that reason, for example, the occupation of the West Bank is illegal. But the occupation of all of historic Palestine is not labeled as illegal. It was something that was normalized, and the world turned a blind eye against that, right? And so the UN talks about this two-state solution. Okay, you know, they began talking about it in the Clinton period, and it was America ultimately, and it was the Israeli occupation entity that rescinded. Why? Because the greatest amount of land theft and annexation happened during the 1990s. That was when Yitzhak Rabin was in power. That was when, you know, Oslo was taking place. So that tells you that actually the occupation entity, I mean, their slogan is from the Nile to the Euphrates, right? Like, by their own admission, there's no such thing as a two-state solution. And when they believed that armed struggle was actually sleeping, little did they know that October the 7th was years in the making and was cooking in the background, right? In 2018, when Trump was in power, you know, he not only brokered the whole Abraham Accords and the deal of the century, but ultimately this deal of the century sought to erase the Palestinian issue. It sought to forego Palestinian statehood. The idea was that you can get some Arab countries to essentially bribe and pay millions and millions in infrastructure projects and, you know, regeneration projects, but ultimately it sought to legalize even the occupations of the Golan Heights, you know, the annexations of the West Bank. You know, they wanted to make it seen as legal, despite the fact that the UN says it's illegal. So they were willing to step on UN resolutions in order to fulfill their goal. And of course, America would let the occupation entity do that and continue, as long as there is no real force of action on the ground, right? When October the 7th happened, that is when the Palestinian issue got put on the focus. It's like the Palestinians were dead, they weren't existent. When October the 7th happened, that's when America was like, hold on, we have no choice but to take the two-state solution into real consideration. Now, if we don't actualize the two-state solution, that is a real issue for us, because it's actually now their only hope of quashing the resistance. It's their only, this two-state solution is actually now America's hope, the only hope of actually securing American interests in the region, because they know that if they don't give Palestinians something, there's going to be more resistance, there's going to be more October the 7th. And they've actually come to realize the inevitable reality that if you keep besieging Palestinians, the Palestinians are going to resist, and it's going to lead to something such that it's uprooting the occupiers. It's even worse in the long run. And that's why Secretary of State Blinken, during the G7, he made it very clear that there's going to be no reoccupation of Gaza. So don't even dream of the settlements that existed prior to 2005, because that was what some of the statements from the occupation entity was coming out as. And they said not only that, but there's going to be no more besiegement of Gaza. We don't want Gaza besieged, because Gaza's besiegement, imagine if under the besiegement, this is what they're capable of. So obviously the American plan moving forward, of course, they want to decimate the Gazan resistance. That's the reason that they haven't called for a ceasefire, is because they ultimately want to drain and they want to bleed the Gazan resistance, right? And they want to get to a point where it's so weak such that it has no more ammunition to fight. And then that's, their catch point. That's when they're able to come and finish it off. That's their plan. That's the reason that it's been so long since they've called for a ceasefire. But ultimately, their hopes is to defeat the Gazan resistance so that they can allow the PA or a Western-friendly face to rule Gaza. But of course, that is the biggest deception ever, because this level of genocide has made even the person that wasn't supportive of resistance in Palestine supportive of it. So ultimately, it's all really backfired, and the Gazan resistance is showing signs of nothing but continued strength and steadfastness on the ground.
Let's go back to the two-state solution. So
Right.
what do you make of that? Like in the sense that they're talking about, it seems like they're trying to settle for something so that you know appeases the masses and appeases people. Or is that where we're heading towards this year?
Right. So it's really important to state that it almost doesn't matter what the Israeli occupation entity thinks, right? So from the Israeli occupation entity's lens, they've made it very clear their worst nightmare is actually the two-state solution, because what that means is they see it as a recipe for another war. They see it as the Gazan resistance is going to emerge stronger. Imagine if without a state, they were able to garner the power that they have to lead a military offensive like they did on October the 7th. So I guess the occupation entity is even willing to sacrifice its soldiers. It's willing to forego the hostages because it considers this war currently a survival war. It considers this war their last chance. But it's really important to stress that after this confrontation ends, most likely Netanyahu is going to be put on the side. We know the occupation entity cannot breathe without the American oxygen, right? So ultimately, it's the American plan that is going
Netanyahu
to be
keeps
put forward.
he keeps coming back though, like a recurrent nightmare or something like that. He keeps coming.
Netanyahu.
This is his third time. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. But it's reached the point where there's just so much at stake. I mean, even on the
Mhm.
level of the people of the occupation entity, the settlers, you know,
Mhm.
it's not a sustainable situation because the internal divide couldn't be any stronger. Now, I mean, the whole strategy of America right now for the region is it's seeking stability. Anything that will
Mhm.
lead to stability in the region, it wants to seek. Of course, in
Mhm.
stability from the American sense, right? Because we know that it's all based on destabilization, essentially.
Mhm.
But so from its lens, having someone like Netanyahu in power is very, very counterproductive because his cabinet, of course, is very, very extreme, and that's contributing to part of the problem. It's not helping in the whole soft war strategy, and America is very big on the soft war strategy. But it's important to
Mhm.
state that for America is not seeking to appease anyone right now. America has no choice but to go forward with the two-state solution. It has absolutely no choice because it's actually dangerous for America if it doesn't, because what that means is more besiegement for the Palestinians is leading to more resistance, is leading to
Mhm.
more of a reaction, and a strengthened resistance axis is really a blow to their interests in a region that's of strategic importance. It will weaken their presence, and that's the last thing that they want. So from their perspective, they need to put a Western friendly entity in charge of Gaza. So consider this scenario, right? So like the US would want to stop the war. It will bring in countries like Egypt, for example, the UAE. It would make them ultimately pay the price for all the death and destruction that the American weapons have caused. So it would make them, pay for reconstruction efforts and projects. Ultimately, in the bid to, we want to redeem the Arab leaders, right? Like that's how they'll sell it to them. Like you guys have normalized with the occupation entity. The world hates you for that. So go redeem yourself. At the same time, they would want to propose that the PA itself reaches out to the resistance in Gaza. So it looks like, oh, it's the resistance in Gaza that has a problem with, the two-state solution, or it's the resistance in Gaza that's on the offensive, and it's the resistance of Gaza that's bringing death and destruction. That's ultimately how they would want to sell it, right? So in that sense, the Gazan resistance will feel like it has no choice but to, accept negotiations with the PA that represents, Palestinians, so to speak, right? And then they'll seek to ultimately drown the PA further. They'll seek to drown Fatah further with money, push projects that improve Palestinian livelihoods. And ultimately, the American strategy is one in which they would want to even split the Palestinian population. They would want to cause factionalism within the Palestinians because they bet on the fact that there are some Palestinians that are so sick of the death and the destruction that they're just going to be like, that's it. Like, we're done, enough. Like, we don't want to go into another confrontation after this. And so that's the American strategy, and that's actually a very dangerous strategy, right? Because it's a strategy of the soft war. It's a strategy where they seek to split the population internally and turn the resistance against the people. But the one thing that keeps my hopes up is the fact that all of this blood that we've witnessed from the Palestinians, no doubt it will not go in vain. There's no way that it can go in vain. And we've reached a point where it's normalized to say that the only solution for Palestinian liberation is armed resistance. That's something that's very much globally now become normalized and globally become recognized. And when mass opinion reaches that level, really those in power have nothing or are unable to do anything about the reality of the situation.
Let's go back to the relationship between the United States and the Israeli occupation entity. Would you say that there? So obviously, as time goes forward, and really this extremist Netanyahu regime is not serving in the best interests of the American soft war. Do you feel like there is a fallout happening between the two regimes? Like you said, the Israeli occupation can't live without the American oxygen.
For sure.
But like, is there fragmentation happening here? Do you feel like America's still in charge and they're unhinged, or they have no choice but to listen? Like,
Yeah,
what's going on?
yeah. So America has always been in charge, and it always will be in charge. And this is a very, very important point. And you just have to you just have to ask yourself the question, what happens if America ceases supplying its weapons? It's sent over 100 over 100 planes filled with cargoes, right? And it's warships into the region. What happens if America seizes? What happens if America pulls out the red card and says, that's it, we're not going to support this entity anymore? As Amir Abdullahian put it, it the occupation entity wouldn't survive for 10 minutes without American support. And the fact that America is the one that is in control of the situation is in the fact that America actually created this entity, not out of care and love for the Zionists. It couldn't care less about anything but its interests. So that's why I emphasize the fact that Netanyahu has absolutely no say in the matter. It's irrelevant what he thinks. But moving forward, as I mentioned, it's an even bigger crisis than who is currently in power. It's a question of the occupation forward. As we've mentioned, it's become a liability. America has come to realize that actually it cannot sustain itself in the region without recognizing the effective and active forces on the ground. And for that reason, America made it very clear. Even Blinken at one point last month mentioned how the Gazan resistance needs to be included in any negotiation moving forward, because they are the ones that have emerged successful out of this confrontation, and the occupation entity has emerged as a failure. So we might not be seeing that accountability happening right now because you're in the middle of the war, right? And it's America's default position is to push as much as it can the occupation entity to deal a decisive blow to the Gazan resistance, but it's unable to do that. Until when is America going to keep supporting an entity that is unable to protect itself? Let alone, it's not even about protecting Western interests, it's incurring harm upon Western interests when the whole of the global supply chain is being disrupted. And the last thing, this is a very important point, the last thing America wants in the region is war. It's not looking to provoke the resistance axis. You could see very simply that, for example, when Pakistan decided to launch a strike onto Iran, rather than using that as an opportunity, America turned a blind eye against that strike. It made it very clear we don't want to aggravate Iran. That's not what we want. For that reason, when the occupation entity even assassinated, the general of the IRGC, Razi Mousawi, they made it very clear that had nothing to do with us. And that's true. It had nothing to do with them, because the last thing they want is to be dragged into a war. And it's not the case that they're able to be dragged into a war. It doesn't
Right.
even matter what the Israeli occupation entity thinks for me to sit here and say, oh, they're trying to drag them into a war, because America is so much bigger than to be able to get dragged into a war. The moment the occupation entity wants to fall out of line, it will
Yeah.
put it in its place, and it can do that, and it has 101 different ways of doing that, because Israel cannot survive without its dependence on America. So once we understand this reality, once we understand that actually America is seeking de-escalation, because this region is so important for America that it's had to directly come and consolidate
Mhm.
itself to fulfill that gap that has been created as a result of the failure of the occupation entity. Yemen is another example. How many ships did Yemen strike? Israeli occupation ships did Yemen strike before America decided to bomb Yemen?
Mhm.
It was over 2 months. They were patiently waiting. Okay, when is Yemen going to stop? When is it going to stop? Until they reached the point where they're like, hold on, this is getting really bad. We need to
Mhm.
create some kind of deterrence equation on the ground. They hoped that the bombings would deter Yemen. Of course, now they're
So
getting
yeah,
Saudi to
Yemen
do the extra
Yemen
work.
became a really big thorn for
Yes,
them. It really did.
100%.
You know,
And they didn't expect it.
there's a new statistic. The WCI found that freight costs, which stood at $1,382 on November 30th, 2023, have risen by 186%, reaching $3,964 on January 25th. And this is due
Right.
to Yemen rerouting these ships. Um, we're obviously, we're seeing movement to de-escalate the situation. Like you said,
Mhm.
troops are being removed. um where are we going to go from here? We've heard from the ICJ this case could truly drag on for years. And I think one of the things that they talked about was that they were going to report back in a month. um and the bombing, the desecration, are we going to keep seeing that continue? A lot of people want to know, like, when is the carnage going to end? What are we going to see next? Is this going to, you know, spindle off into a regional war? Or, and then with American elections coming up as well this year, like,
Yeah.
what do we make of the situation going forward?
For sure. I mean, the trajectory is definitely one of de-escalation. I can't stress this enough, because America has every opportunity to escalate, but it's been doing the absolute opposite.
Mm-hmm.
That's the last thing it wants, because that's ultimately America shooting itself on the foot, unless, of course, it decides to shoot itself on the foot.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, so what we're seeing is a overall trajectory of de escalation, which basically means that there's going to be continued attacks, and they will be sustained, but they'll probably reduce in their magnitude. So, for example, if we're talking back to like a month or 2 months ago, easily in a day, you'd have 700 killed. You'd easily in a day have 1,000 killed. Now you're looking at the statistics of like 150, people killed in a day, for example. So the number of, civilians that are getting killed has decreased, but of course America still yet has not called for a ceasefire, and that's very clear from all the press releases and the conferences of when its representatives speak, because ultimately they still hope that they want to weaken the Gazan resistance to a point where they can ultimately push that two-state solution from a good position. I think they're most likely surprised that the Gazan resistance is still able to continue to fight and still has the munition reserve to continue. We're talking 3 months in. That's not a joke. Even when you look at the Gazan resistance, for example, it's been some time before they've targeted the heart of the occupation entity in 1948. Um,
But
and,
can
and
you lower
yes,
your screen just a little?
yeah,
Just a
sure.
little bit. Thank you.
Is
There
that
you
okay?
go.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
So ultimately, the occupation entity is unaware of the ways in which weapons are getting delivered into Gaza. So in their
mhm,
mind, ultimately, what they're doing right now is they're trying to buy time to bleed Hamas. That's what they want to do.
mhm,
They want to
I
bleed the
see.
resistance. They want to drain it, basically. And so for
Mhm,
that reason, they keep giving the occupation entity weapons. It's like, come on, keep hitting them. But of course, they're just
mhm,
biting themselves. And for anyone that's reading proper news, where real information is coming out from Al Mayadeen, for example, or the Cradle, or TMJ, for example, the Israeli occupation entity is sustaining heavy losses, and
Mm-hmm.
that's why they've gone into phase three. So this is the third phase in the war, in which they have, withdrawn their troops, their reserve soldiers from the battlefield. Ultimately, that's not a decision of the establishment. That's a decision of the reserve force itself. That's
Mm-hmm.
unwilling to fight. It's unwilling to give its life. It's
Mm-hmm.
unwilling to die. They don't see this as a cause that's worth giving their life for, whereas the Palestinians, of course, they do. So ultimately, right now, the strategy is still let's bleed the Gazan resistance. But little
Mm-hmm.
do they know that Gaza has its ways of getting weapons delivered to it. It's really interesting. Even with the whole tunnel situation, they
Mm-hmm.
discovered that there's over 500 kilometers. I mean, that's huge.
Wow.
500 kilometers worth
Mm-hmm.
of tunnels, the length of the tunnels within the Gaza Strip, some that extend even into the occupation entity, that they are unaware of, that they were unable to capture its root. Because I remember one of the analysts saying that the person who kind of devised that plan for the
Mm-hmm.
tunnels has the highest IQ ever, because
Wow.
these tunnels are designed in such a way that they don't link to one another. So one tunnel, it might end after 300 meters, right? And they've discovered a few of the tunnel shafts, and they've seen it, but what does that amount to? 3 kilometers out of 500 kilometers.
Mm-hmm.
So it's huge, and every time they're in Gaza, they're paying hefty losses, because the Gazan resistance is keeping its eye out on the soldiers, and is targeting them wherever they see them. And over 1,000 Israeli tanks have caught fire since October the 7th. So you can only imagine the number of casualties and the number of deaths that don't go reported, of course, for psychological warfare reasons, to make it seem like the occupation entity is actually winning this war. Because on top of killing civilians in Gaza the way that they are, the brutal aggression on Gaza, not only that, but you're also losing the war. It's a double loss for the occupation entity. At least if the occupation entity there was some kind of military victory, it can say that out loud, that we're one step closer towards defeating the Gazan resistance. But for those
Right.
psychological warfare tactics, they don't actually reveal the extent of the losses that are being incurred. So for sure, from a civilian toll, that is, I mean, the numbers are reducing with time, as much as it's difficult to even see the death of one Gazan. But ultimately, the trajectory is one of ceasefire. Ultimately, it's de-escalation, because the resistance axis don't want a confrontation. And if a confrontation is ever going to happen, it's not going to come from the American side. It would come from the resistance side. But the resistance is calculated enough to not drag the region into a war that would further expand the fire of conflict. And already the occupation entity is sustaining heavy losses at the hands of just one axis from the resistance. So that's even more powerful than if other entities were to get involved, if Lebanon was to get involved, if Iran was going to start firing missiles. Ultimately, the issue of Gaza will be lost, the issue of Palestine will be lost, because then it will start to appear as though it's a regional war. Then it will start to appear like the occupation entity itself is the victim, in this region that's so inherently hostile. Whereas now the world is seeing the true reality of the occupation entity, its true ferocity, and that's being made clear to the world.
Thank you so much, Batul, for joining us today. It's
Thank you
nice
for
to
having
hear
me.
from you from
Nice
time
to
to
meet you.
time.
Thank you very
Inshallah,
much.
you'll join me more. Thank you all
Inshallah.
for tuning in to The Hard Truth. Stay tuned for more episodes where I bring in guests and people to shed light on world issues, as well as weekly newscasts. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.